Why is it so difficult to make amends? Welcome to the Therapy Brothers podcast.
I'm Brannon.
I'm Tyler.
We're brothers,
We're therapists.
and we know recovery.
Bring your stories, your questions, your successes with real recovery.
Hey, Tyler, you ready to have some hard conversations?
Let's do it.
Let the Therapy Brothers podcast begin.
What is going on, you guys? Tyler here, your wandering therapist. Again, this episode, I am alone. I'm solo. I've lost my better half. Brannon is, he called me, he texted me yesterday, and he was just deathly sick. His voice didn't even sound like himself. In fact, he could almost not even hear him. So I told him to just take the day off, and either fortunately or unfortunately enough for all of you listeners, we also had a caller that just canceled. So you're left with me and the own thoughts in my own brain. And so we're going to talk today a little bit about making amends, because it's a topic that I feel like I need to talk about, and it's been weighing on my heart pretty heavily as of late. I am constantly looking at things from this perspective, especially as I'm working with my clients on a day-to-day basis and going, how can we free ourselves even further? I love the idea of, as we go deep into the hole of like whatever prison we've been in, whether that's the pain of our trauma or whether that's our addiction and the shame that's there, part of the recovery process is systematically uncovering parts of ourselves that maybe we've forgotten or that we haven't nurtured or cultivated. And we systematically build this, what I call a wholehearted life that has vibrance and color to it. And I see it as a process of continual liberation. And this principle that I want to talk about with you today is something that I see as vitally important wherever you fall on the spectrum of recovery, whether you've been the victim of the betrayal, whether you're the one who's done the betraying, whether you've got the addiction or you don't. This is a human thing, and this is a human principle that so many people neglect. People who work really good, hard recoveries often neglect this step because it's so difficult. It's so hard to do. And in missing this step, it's almost like they leave behind the remnants of this emotional cancer that can then start to grow again. And we're going to talk about how that happens and why that happens a little bit today. Before I get too far into this, I just want to give another shout out for the Radiant Dawn Conference. It's our women's conference, Southern Utah. All things are covered, your food, your lodging, your activities. Brannon and I are both there. We've created a program that is designed, it's patterned a little bit after something called the Hero's Journey, which is designed to help you step deeper into this process of facing some of the things that might be holding you back, and then making peace with those things, and then stepping into a new superpower as a result of what you're learning with those things, and then liberating yourself and freeing yourself from some of the burdens that you've been carrying, whatever that is, whether that's the betrayal and the trauma that you brought, or past shame that you're holding on to, or a wrestle that you're having with a higher power. This is an event that is designed to have an emotionally corrective experience rather than just a mentally and rationally corrective experience. It's one of my favorite things that we do. So if you're interested, radiantdawn.org, go there and check it out. So I want to start today by just reading. Some of this reading comes from the White Book, the essay White Book. And I'm just going to read on page 123, the first paragraph. And while I read this, I would challenge you as you're listening to just see what comes up for you. See what emotions come up for you. See what images come up for you. See where your brain starts to turn and your thoughts start to go. And just pay attention, okay? So this says the indelible list. We've always had this list inside us. It was burned into our brains. That was the problem. We kept pushing it under, covering it over, drugging it, running from it, or trying to sex it out of existence. But those names, faces, and scenes just kept coming back to haunt us. And the more we pretended we were not blameworthy, the more wrong we did, and the longer the list grew. Now, as you sit with that for a second, what comes up for you? I wonder how many of you actually have your own list start to form in your mind. This is the list of people that over the course of your life, being a human being, you have wronged in some way. People that you know deep down inside that you treated unfairly. And now that list is there, and think about what it said there. How much time and energy has gone into pushing it under, covering it over, drugging it, running from it, or trying to sex it out of existence? Or maybe not sex, maybe it's social media or spending money or numb it out. That every time you sit down and think about that list, and we all have a list. And if you don't have a list, you're either just like Jesus or you're in total denial because you're a human being. That every one of us through our lives has had a lasting impact in the negative way on certain people. Sit and think with that list and notice what it does to your body. Maybe if you can actually go there, you start to feel that twist inside your core, right down in that pit in your stomach, or that your heart starts to race, or for me, there's this tightness in my chest that starts to form. And it's a painful realization that I might have some open-ended loops in my life that if I were to actually step through the fear of those open loops, I could close those loops. I could lay down some of the burden that I carry subconsciously every single day, and I could have a deeper level of lasting freedom. So that's what we're talking about today, you guys, is this list of people. And I want you guys to just have those names rolling through your brain as we talk for the rest of the day. I hope that this episode, if you can hang in there with me, will actually help you to move a step closer to freeing yourself by actually following through on what the 12 steps talk about. So today we're talking about steps 8 and 9 in the 12 steps. And I'll just read these to you really quickly. Now, step 8, I made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. So that list, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to be open to the list of people whom I may have harmed, and I am going to be willing to make amends to them all. And step 9 is I made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So I need to have a willing heart towards making amends. And then in the situations where making amends would not cause more harm, I actually need to pursue on my end the making of those amends. So as I'm saying that, thinking, and you're thinking about those people in your brain, how many of you just had something tighten up and go, I don't know that I want to go pursue making amends right now? If you raise your hand right now, you're not alone. This is such a difficult process, and I think there's a couple of reasons that make it difficult. So I'd ask you, why is it so difficult? You've got this person in your mind, and what most of us do, we almost have to, is that we, over the years, we have to justify not making amends. And in order to do that, we often vilify the very person whom we've harmed. We actually make them responsible for our mistreatment of them. And how sick is that in our brains, right? We do this all the time. Well, it's because they did this thing. Well, if they just wouldn't have done that thing, we justify our own behaviors by passing it off on something about the other person or something else, right? And we're gonna get into that a little bit. You'll see this in some of the examples that I share in just a second. Here, another little paragraph from the book around this. Little did we realize that every wrong that we did was adding to our burden of guilt and distress and creating more illness. We could not wish or will the guilt away. Only when we stopped running, when we turned around and looked at them, sorry, I'm getting emotional, full in the face, and said about making them right, was their power over us broken. That's when we were set free. Today's episode, you guys, is about thinking about those relationships in your life and finding those relationships that you still need to look full in the face and take ownership for the ways that maybe you've harmed it in the past. And if you're willing to start to do those things, you will unlock levels of freedom and levels of joy and potential levels of connection, not always, that you never thought possible. You're going to start to realize that you've been carrying things for years that you didn't need to carry and that you no longer need to carry. So, why is it so difficult? Why is it so hard to go to somebody and say, I'm sorry? I hear this all the time from my clients. They come in, they're like, I know I did that. And I sit and they'll tell me the whole story and I'll say, okay, well, what's your next step? Well, I should probably call them up and say, I'm sorry. Or, man, I did this thing to somebody over at Walmart the other day and man, I shouldn't have done that. Like, well, what do you need to do? Well, I probably ought to go tell them I'm sorry and then I'm grateful that they're doing their job. Okay, why don't you do that? It's not a big deal. Or, oh, you know what? It didn't matter to them. It's probably more about me than it was for them anyway. Or, well, actually, they did mistreat me. They were still mean to me. I'm justified in what I did. And it's like, no, you're actually not because your heart's not free, right? But why is it so difficult? I'd submit that at least one of the reasons why it's so difficult is that when we do something that we know is outside of our values, we tend to not only feel our own values start to shake, we throw another layer over the top of it as shame. Well, because I did this thing, that makes me a bad person. And because shame is in the mix, shame makes us feel small. Shame makes us lose the sense of who we are. Shame makes us not like who we are. At least we define ourselves as not being lovable or not being good enough or being flawed or imperfect or wrong or bad or something. And many of us feel that if we were to speak out loud the wrongs that we've done, we would actually be diminishing ourselves further and admitting to the world how terrible we are. And so when we have a very small sense of ourselves, it's really difficult to take ownership for our choices. Now, you see the trap in all of this, right? If the pathway to freedom is to take ownership and accountability so that you can move through it and be a better person, shame says don't take ownership because if you do, you'll be smaller. And then you end up feeling smaller because you then have to justify staying at war with somebody who it's your fault that you harmed in the first place, that you did something outside of your own values, but now you can't stand the thought of being seen as small. One second thing that happens is fear, right? When we know we've done something wrong to somebody else, it's a scary proposition to have to confront that person and in a certain sense throw ourselves out there to possibly be mistreated or rejected or even have something thrown back in our face. And that's scary. Most of us don't like potential conflict. And the fear is that we feel like it's justified if the other person were to give us something back that's conflictual because in a certain sense, we believe we've earned it. And so we would often rather stay away from that and just hope to sweep it under the rug and pretend it's not there anymore than to actually just take full ownership, take our medicine, and move on with our life. The other thing that happens is we think that when we make amends, it means we have to be best friends again. That's not what amends is about. Amends is about getting ownership where it belongs. Amends is about freeing the other person of whatever impact you might have had on them by taking ownership of the fact that you acknowledge that you acted outside of your values and that you may have done some damage to them. I look at this with like long-term relationships that I deal with marriages, right? So many times, one of the tripwires in the couple as they move through their recovery and they get through the sobriety piece and they start to get grounded again and they actually start to kind of lean together, there's still these little undertones of resentment and anger on both sides, but at least we're not in pure crisis like it was on D-Day. And couples will stay there in that holding pattern for years and years, sometimes the rest of their lives, rather than step through the next step of it, which is to take an accounting for the ways that they've affected their relationship and to let their partner know that they see it, that they acknowledge it, that they're sad about it, that if they could, they would try to fix it. which that's always a hard one because a lot of times the things that we do are unfixable. They're human mistakes that we can't go back and actually fix. If we can fix it, we should with amends. But a lot of times that's another scary part is we have to go to somebody with an unfixable problem and acknowledge that we broke it and say, yeah, I don't have the tools to fix it. I just want you to know that I broke it and I see you and I see your pain, right? That's scary for us. So most of us choose to sit on the sidelines around this topic and eat the shame and the guilt and the burdens on a day to day, little bit at a time, pretend it's not there kind of a way, rather than stepping into it and through it. So I wanted to just share a couple of stories with you. And this will get kind of personal for me. I'm going to share one of my own personal stories in a second, but to sort of set the stage, I remember hearing this. It was in a talk a long time ago, and it's always stuck with me. And partly probably because I could so deeply relate to it, but it's always stuck with me. And it's a popular story. You can find it on the internet, but I'm going to read it to you right now. It's called, I'm already getting emotional just getting ready to read it. It's called The Martyrdom of Andy Drake. And it says, Andy was a sweet, amusing little guy whom everybody liked, yet harassed because that was just the way one treated Andy Drake. He took the kidding well. Andy always smiled back with those great big eyes that seemed to say, thank you, thank you, thank you, with each sweeping blink. For us fifth graders, Andy was our outlet. He was our whipping boy. He even seemed grateful to pay this special price for the membership in our group. Andy Drake don't eat no cake, and his sister don't eat no pie. If it wasn't for the welfare dole, all the Drakes would die. Andy even appeared to appreciate this sing-song parody of Jack Sprat. The rest of us really enjoyed it, bad grammar and all. I do not know why Andy had to endure this special treatment to deserve our friendship and membership in the group. It just evolved naturally, no plan or discussion. I don't recall anyone ever mentioning in this connection that Andy's father was in prison, or that his mother took in washing and men, or that Andy's ankles, elbows, and fingernails were always dirty and his old coat was way too big. We soon wore all the fun out of those. Andy never fought back. Snobbery blossoms in the very young, I guess. It was plain now that the group attitude was that it was our right to belong, but that Andy was a member by our sufferance. Despite all that, we all liked Andy until that day, until that very moment. He's different. We don't want him, do we? Which one of us said it? I've wanted to blame Randolph all these years, but I cannot honestly say who spoke those trigger words that brought out the savagery lying dormant but so near the surface in all of us. It doesn't matter who, for the fervor with which we took up the cause revealed us all. But I didn't want to do what we did. For years, I tried to console myself with that. Then one day I stumbled on the unwelcome but irrefutable words that convicted me forever. The hottest corners of hell are reserved for those who, during a moment of crisis, maintain their neutrality. The weekend was to be like others the group had enjoyed together. After school on a Friday, we would meet at the home of one of the members, mine this time, for a camp out in the nearby woods. Our mothers, who did most of the preparation for these safaris, fixed an extra pack for Andy, who was to join us after chores. We quickly made camp, mother's apron strings forgotten. With individual courage amplified by the group, we were now men against the jungle. The others decided that since it was my party, I should be the one to give Andy the news. I, I who had long believed that Andy secretly thought a little more of me than he did the others because of the puppy-like way he looked at me. I, who often felt Andy revealing his love and appreciation with those huge, wide-open eyes. I can still plainly see Andy as he came toward me in the long, dark tunnel of trees that leaked only enough of the late afternoon light to kaleidoscope changing patterns on his soiled old sweatshirt. Andy was on his rusty, one-of-a-kind bike, a girl's model with sections of garden hose wired to the rims for tires. He appeared excited and happier than I'd ever seen him, this frail little guy who had been an adult all his life. I knew he was savoring the acceptance by the in group, this first chance to belong, to have boy fun, to do boy things. Andy waved to me as I stood in the camp clearing, awaiting him. I ignored his happy greeting. He vaulted off the funny old bike and trotted over to me, full of joy and conversation. The others concealed in the tent were silent, but I felt their support. Why don't he get serious? Can't he see that I'm not returning his cheer? Can't he see by now that his euphoria is not reaching me? Then suddenly he did see. His innocent countenance opened up even more, leaving him entirely vulnerable. His whole demeanor said, "It's going to be very bad, isn't it, Ben? Let's have it." Well practiced in facing disappointment, he didn't even brace for the blow, and he never fought back. Incredulously, I heard myself say, "Andy, we don't want you." Hauntingly vivid still is the stunning quickness with which two huge tears sprang into Andy's eyes and just stayed there. Vivid because of a million maddening reruns of that scene in my mind. The way Andy looked at me, frozen for an eternal moment. What was it? It wasn't hate. Was it shock? Was it disbelief? Was it pity for me or forgiveness? Finally, a fleet little tremor broke across Andy's lips, and he turned without appeal or even a question to make the long, lonely trip back home in the dark. As I turned and entered the tent, someone, the last one of us to feel the full weight of the moment, started the old doggerel. Andy Drake don't eat no cake, and his sister don't. Then it was unanimous. No vote taken, no words spoken, but we all knew we had done something horribly, cruelly wrong. We were swept over by the delayed impact of dozens of lessons and sermons, each of us heard perhaps for the first time, inasmuch as ye have done it under the least of these. In that long, hushed, heavy moment, we gained an understanding new to us then, but indelibly fixed in our minds. We had destroyed an individual made in the image of God with the only weapon for which he had no defense. We had no excuse. Rejection. Andy's poor attendance in school made it difficult to tell when he actually withdrew, but one day it dawned on me that he was gone forever. I had spent too many days struggling within myself to find and polish a proper way of telling Andy how witheringly ashamed and sorry I was. I now know that to have hugged Andy and to have cried with him and even to have joined with him in a long silence would have been enough. It may have healed us both. I never saw Andy Drake again. I have no idea where he went or where he is, if he is. But to say I haven't seen Andy is not entirely accurate. In the decades since the autumn day in the Arkansas woods, I have encountered thousands of Andy Drakes. My conscience places Andy's mask over the face of every disadvantaged person with whom I come in contact. Each stares back at me with the same haunting and expecting look which became fixed in my mind that day long ago. Dear Andy Drake, the chance you will ever see these words is quite remote, but I must try. It is much too late for this confession to purge my conscience of guilt. I neither expect nor want it to. What I do pray for, my little friend of long ago, is that you might somehow learn of and be lifted up by knowing of and continuing force of your sacrifice. What you suffered at my hands that dreadful day and the grace you showed in response has been twisted, turned, and molded by God into a blessing. I hope this knowledge might ease the memory of that terrible day for you. I have been no saint, Andy, nor have I done all the things I could and should have done with my life. But what I yearn for you to know is that I have never again knowingly betrayed an Andy Drake, nor, pray, shall I ever. Uh, Powerful story. For me, especially powerful because in this occasion, I actually have my own versions of some Andy Drakes in my life. Now, you might be sitting here thinking, maybe you don't have that story of the boys in the woods, but it's very real. It's a very real possibility that you do have somebody's face staring at you right now in your mind. I have one staring back at me in my mind. I was probably about the same age. There's a new kid that moved in our neighborhood. His name was Joseph. And we had this really cool neighborhood growing up. We lived across the street from the church that we went to. We had free reign to run around the parking lot. We'd play roller hockey, we'd play football, we'd play hide and seek, we'd play night games over there. It was basically our version of the jungle. And the whole neighborhood knew from like 5 or 6 blocks around, everybody would show up at the church every single day after school and on Saturdays at night times. And it was welcome to the whole neighborhood. Any kid could show up and they could take part in the games that we played and the things that we did. And I remember a new boy named Joseph that moved in, and he was instantly different than maybe the rest of us were used to. You could tell that he was disadvantaged. He didn't have clothes that fit. He, smelled of smoke. So he was a little bit different than most of the rest of us who didn't have parents who smoked. He was a little bit socially, maybe not as adept at some of the other kids for his age, and it made him an easy target. It's funny how in that story, there's just this natural currency that the one kid had to be picked on in order to be accepted, but everybody else got free admittance. And that's kind of how Joseph was. I remember one day in particular, we were playing roller hockey and something happened. I think I insulted Joseph over something. I think we bumped into each other and then I insulted him and he insulted me back. And somehow that wasn't okay. Somehow I could do it to him, but when he did it back to me, that wasn't fair and it wasn't okay. And I picked a fight with him and I ended up basically running him off. And and I never saw him again. That memory, much like it said in that story, has been etched in my mind for years. As I've done my own work and made this list of people who I've harmed in step 8, he remains at the top of the list. And part of the reason he remains at the top of the list is because I have never been able to know how to reach him. I don't even remember what his last name was. I think I've tried to find him. I've never been able to find him. And so there's this open-ended loop in my life that if I ever had the chance to sit face to face with Joseph, I would tell him how deeply sorry I am for the ways that I've affected his life. I can only imagine what it must have been like to be vulnerable, to feel like he didn't already fit in, to so desperately want to belong with the group and to have the people who were in the in group push him away. I want Joseph to know how deeply sorry I am. I don't think it's a consolation, but part of why I do what I do is because I feel this burning inside to protect all of the other Josephs in my life, to stand up for the underdog, to fight for the one who doesn't quite have it all together anymore. I think that's one of the reasons I love a good underdog story, is because I hope and pray that Joseph has found a way to find a great life and to know how deeply loved he is by a Father in heaven who loves him, regardless of how stupid, immature kids have maybe treated him. So I may not ever be able to find Joseph, but if I could, I would tell him that I'm sorry. And now my challenge is back to you to think about for a minute. Back to that list in your mind. Bring up those faces. Think of those memories. Don't run from them. Don't push them down. Even if it's a painful feeling that you're having coming up inside of you, don't push it back. Sit with it. And ask yourself, What's your next step? What do you need to do to make amends? If it's going to cause more harm, don't do it. But as you sit with that, there will come an answer. I need to write a letter. I need to try to find them. I need to make a phone call. I need to practice some self forgiveness for myself because I don't know that I'll ever be able to make amends fully. I need to surrender it back to God. Whatever it is that's coming up inside of you, don't let your pride and your ego and your shame get in the way. Take the next step. Step through that fear. Step through the doubt. Step through all the things in your body that are telling you not to do it. And see the freedom that's waiting on the other side. There's freedom. You'll be practicing surrender. You won't have control over it anymore. You'll be practicing honesty. You won't have to live in denial anymore. And in doing so, you will find freedom. Even if it doesn't go well, you will experience more freedom. This is an underrated part of recovery, you guys. It might be inside of your own marriages. Some of the hardest places are when someone has actually wronged you, and in response, you've wronged them back. And because you've been wronged, it's hard to take ownership for your part. You will not be able to get better. You will not be able to heal your marriage or relationship if on your end of things, you still have things that you haven't accounted for, that you haven't acknowledged. It will keep your heart at war, and that heart at war will fuel shame and doubt and fear and justification and denial. So have the courage. It doesn't mean that what the other person didn't do wasn't legitimate. It is. It doesn't discount the legitimacy of the way that you felt or the things that you've been through. It only frees you to take ownership for your part. So hopefully this is helpful for you. I know I got a little bit emotional on this one today. I tend to be that way a little bit more, and I can do it more because Brannon happens to be gone, so he doesn't get to mock me for it. Now he'll have to mock me in a different episode or something, right? But I hope that something is stirred inside of you as a result of this discussion that we've had today. I hope there's people in your mind right now that are coming and surfacing, and you're going, yeah, I remember that person, or oh, that's been there for a really long time, or oh, I don't want to hold on to that burden anymore. You don't have to carry that burden anymore. It doesn't do you or anybody else any good to carry that burden anymore. So I hope this is helpful for you. I would love to hear of your own Andy Drake stories because I know that many of us have those things. And I believe that in telling those stories, that's also part of the way to free ourselves from the bondage that we've been in as a result of those things. So I would love to hear your stories. I hope this is helpful for you. I want to pause really quickly and just say thank you. Thank you to all of our listeners. You don't know what it means to get the feedback that we get back from so many of you that what we're doing is helping you and making a difference. And you don't know what it means to feel your support back. So thank you very, very much. Hope you guys have a great day. And until next time, keep on keeping on.